are you going to keep the house? See if she finishes scraping?
Okay, I'm standing in an excavation unit in a rock shelter in Big South Fork National River and Recreation Area. My feet are about 180 centimeters below the ground surface. For those people not familiar with the metric system, that's about 6 feet. And I'm going to point out the stratigraphy that we've exposed in this excavation unit, beginning with the top zone, which is a dark grayish brown layer, about a hand's width and thickness. This represents the most recent deposit at the site. It contains chert, burned rock, lots of little pieces of charcoal, and lots of recent plant material, including all these rootlets that you can see scattered about within the zone. Below that we have a brown zone, what we're calling Zone B, the upper Zone B and Zone A. Zone B has less artifacts in it. It has occasional pieces of sandstone and an occasional piece of charcoal, but compared to the zone above it, Zone A, this has much less material and may be almost considered a sterile deposit. In other words, it was deposited at a time when there was no human occupation here at the rock shelter. Below Zone B, we have another dark zone called Zone C, which is very similar in color and in material content to the Zone A at the top of the unit. The zone is visible about a hand's width again all the way across. It contains a large amount of burned sandstone, a lot of charcoal, and from this level we have recovered ceramics and projectile points, which would lead us to believe that this dates sometime between the early and middle woodland time period, somewhere from about 1000 BC up until about 0 AD, the time of Christ. Below Zone C, we have another light brown colored soil, very similar to Zone B up here. This soil has a few pieces of charcoal and an occasional piece of sandstone, an occasional piece of chert, but much like Zone B above it, this soil is relatively lacking in artifactual material and is almost sterile. Again, a unit which represents very little occupation here at the rock shelter at the time this soil was deposited. Below that layer we have another layer which is gray in color. Yet again contains burned sandstone, lots of little flecks of charcoal, and we get pieces of chert, primarily flakes from this deposit, but we haven't picked up any diagnostics. So we know that there were people living here at the site at the time that this dark gray zone was laid down, but we just not have gotten any diagnostic artifacts from this zone to let us know approximately the time period in which it was deposited. Below this gray zone we have another light brown zone, which, much like the lighter brown zone soils above it, is relatively few artifacts, very little charcoal, in fact very rare charcoal, and virtually no burned sandstone at all in this zone. This is another sterile zone, and this was deposited at a time when there were no humans living here at the site. Below this zone we have a white band and then a striped orange section of soil, and then upon the bottom of the unit we have sandstone blocks. All of these soils were deposited thousands of years ago before there were any human occupation at the site, and therefore we find no artifacts at all in these bottom levels. So what we have overall in this stratigraphic unit are 3 cultural layers separated by sterile zones, which allow us to look at segments of time which have not been disturbed by later occupations. It's kind of like a layer cake. Once this zone of human occupation was laid down, the site was not occupied for hundreds of years, and it was sealed off by a sterile zone. The site was reoccupied again, this time sometime during the woodland period, sometime around 500 BC, and another deposit of material was laid down. The site was then abandoned, and another layer of soil was deposited, which lacks artifacts for the most part, and represents a period when the site was not occupied. And then the most recent deposit represents the most recent occupation of the site during the Mississippian period, possibly a little bit earlier, and we find within this zone some historic artifacts as well, reflecting the fact that this site was used by Euro-Americans in part to manufacture stills for the illegal whiskey trade.